In the 1950s, a pension was more than a monthly check. It was a quiet promise that after decades of work, a person could finally rest. Governments could make that promise confidently because the math was on their side. Populations were young, energy was cheap, productivity was rising, and national debts were small enough to ignore. A single worker could comfortably support multiple retirees, and the system seemed unshakable. But the world that made those promises possible no longer exists. Today's workers stand in a completely different landscape, one defined by shrinking birth rates, stagnant wages, soaring debt, and retirement ages that keep inching upward. The crisis isn't approaching. It's already happening in the shadows, disguised as indexing changes, frozen benefits, and subtle policy adjustments. No one notices until it's too late. Each reform is sold as temporary, but together they reveal a system quietly failing from within. By 2030, the illusion breaks. That is the year when boomers fully retire, the worker base collapses, and pension payouts surge beyond what governments can conceal. This is the moment the arithmetic becomes undeniable. To understand the crash, we must go back to where pensions first failed. Pension collapses never begin with headlines or protests. They begin quietly, with a simple shift in numbers that every major empire has eventually failed to escape. After the Second World War, Britain discovered this the hard way. The empire was fading, the workforce was shrinking, and the number of dependents soared. For every worker paying in, more retirees were drawing out. The promises made in stronger decades suddenly became impossible to fund. Japan repeated the pattern in the 1990s. Its population peaked. A nation built on lifelong employment found itself with too many elderly citizens and too few young contributors. Insolvency didn't arrive overnight, crept in through the demographic doorway no one wanted to acknowledge. And then came Greece in 2008. Where pension guarantees collided with brutal mathematical reality, the ratio of workers to retirees collapsed, and the system imploded on itself. Across every example, the catalyst is identical. Once the workers per retiree ratio falls below 2, recovery becomes mathematically impossible. Most Western nations will reach 1-to-1 by 2030, but demographics are only stage 1 of the collapse. Stage 1 to stage 4. The hidden collapse pattern. Every pension crisis follows the same 4-stage sequence, a pattern so consistent it almost reads like a script. It begins with Stage 1. Politicians, eager for votes, offer generous retirement benefits. They know they will never personally have to fund. The cost is distant, abstract, someone else's problem. Then comes Stage 2. Governments quietly redirect pension contributions toward short-term programs, wars, or political projects, assuming that future growth will fill the gap. It never does. Stage 3 arrives when demographics turn. Too many retirees, too few workers, and a shrinking tax base begin grinding the system down. At first, the imbalance seems manageable. Then it accelerates. Finally comes Stage 4. Silent cuts. Inflation erodes real payouts. Retirement ages rise. Contribution rates climb. Benefits freeze. None of these reforms are announced as cuts, but together they reveal a system that can no longer keep its promises. The United States, the UK, Canada, Germany, and Japan have already completed all 4 stages, and by the time Stage 4 becomes visible, the crash is already locked in. After Stage 4, governments face only 2 choices, and both are devastating. The kill switch. Stage 5. Inflation as policy. Stage 5 is where the collapse stops being theoretical and becomes a deliberate strategy. When governments realize they can't meet their pension promises, they turn to the quietest and most politically convenient tool available: inflation. It is the kill switch that allows liabilities to disappear without ever admitting a single failure. Britain perfected this in the 1970s. Without passing one law to reduce benefits, the real value of pensions fell by nearly 30%. Retirees received the same pound amount, but it purchased far less. The cut was never spoken aloud. It simply happened in silence. The echoes are unmistakable today. Official CPI numbers are massaged downward to soften the truth. Cost of living adjustments rise at half the pace of actual expenses. Real benefits shrink year after year, even as governments insist nothing has changed. This is the hidden pension cut of the modern era known as unacknowledged, and already underway across the developed world. But inflation alone can't fix a system this broken. Stage 6. The investment trap. Stage 6 begins when the old foundations of pension finance collapse. For decades, pensions relied on safe bonds and predictable interest rates to meet their obligations. But when central banks drove rates to zero, that stability evaporated overnight. The math no longer worked, and funds were pushed into dangerous territory. CalPERS began chasing private equity deals it once would have avoided. In 2022, UK pensions came within hours of imploding after leveraged bets backfired, forcing emergency intervention. Even Japan's massive GPI, EFT, a largest pension fund on Earth, lost tens of billions as it was dragged into volatile markets. This is the moment pensions stopped behaving like retirement guarantees and started acting like speculative portfolios. When safe returns disappear, risk becomes the only remaining option, and every gamble is justified as necessary. What was once a conservative system quietly transformed into a casino with retirees' futures on the table. But the final stage is the one no government dares speak about. Stage 7, the 2030 deadline. Stage 7 is where every trend, every warning, every hidden imbalance finally converge, because 2030 is not an opinion. It is mathematics. By the end of this decade, the largest generation in history will be fully retired. The worker shortage reaches its absolute peak. Healthcare spending surges as aging populations require more support. Contribution pools shrink as younger workers struggle with stagnant wages and rising costs. And dependency ratios hit levels no modern economy has ever survived without drastic change. Governments already sense the impact. Retirement ages are rising with suspicious speed. Wealth taxes and solidarity contributions appear in policy drafts. Traditional defined benefit pensions are quietly replaced with defined contribution plans that shift all risk onto the individual. And everywhere, citizens are urged to rely on private savings because the public systems can no longer support the promises once made. This is the point where denial ends. After 2030, the system can only survive through open cuts. The math is too large, the obligations too heavy, the workforce too small. What feels gradual today becomes unavoidable. What happens after pensions hit the wall? When a pension system finally breaks, governments never announce a collapse. Instead, they turn to the same three emergency tools every failing empire has reached for throughout history. The first is austerity. In the USSR during the 1980s, budget cuts gutted social programs while officials insisted everything was under control. Then comes wealth extraction. Britain, in 1976, raised taxes, froze wages, and imposed harsh levies as it struggled to satisfy its creditors. And when those measures fail, nations move to the final tool: currency resets. Argentina has repeated this cycle again and again, erasing debts through devaluation and inflation, each time claiming it was necessary for national stability. The pattern is universal. Leaders avoid admitting failure. They shift blame to previous governments, rewrite pension formulas, and restructure the system quietly, step by step, hoping the public won't notice the erosion. What begins as temporary reform becomes permanent change, always at the expense of retirees. So, what does this mean for individuals today? The pension crisis is more than a failure of economics. It is a failure of trust between generations. One generation was promised stability, dignity, and rest. The next inherited obligations so large they could never realistically be met. As the system strained, governments chose to protect the machinery rather than the people inside, it preserving numbers on a balance sheet, while individuals quietly absorb the losses. This is how societies begin to fracture. Not through sudden collapse, but through slow abandonment, when the promises that held a nation together become heavier than its capacity to honor them. For millions, the fear is deeply personal: rising costs, uncertain futures, and the uneasy sense that something once solid is slipping away. Beneath every statistic is a human life, adjusting to a reality they weren't warned about. But there is still one final truth. The pension crash is not something waiting beyond the horizon. It is already unfolding in the quiet corners of policy and inflation, hidden beneath phrases like adjustments, reforms, and temporary measures. By 2030, the disguise falls away. The numbers that have been stretched, softened, and reinterpreted will finally speak for themselves. And when they do, the truth becomes undeniable. Yet history offers a softer light. Societies do not endure because their governments foresee every crisis. They endure because individuals recognize the pattern early, adapt, and refuse to be caught unprepared. Awakening is not about fear, it is about clarity. It is the moment a society stops waiting for reassurance and starts understanding the forces shaping its future. And clarity is the first step toward resilience.